Alrighty, so here we go with chapter 21. This chapter gets into water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance, and it's going to tie in a couple of the other body systems that we have already talked about and see how the different body systems work together to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so chapter 21, if I can get this to move, there we go. Begins with the balance concept. And in terms of physiology, balance means a state of constancy, keeping things constant, okay? We've talked a lot about homeostasis, okay? But at the root of homeostasis is basically constancy, keeping things in basically kind of a constant, constant state, okay? So, like I mentioned, we're talking about water, electrolytes, and then acid, base balance as well. Okay, so one thing to remember that we talked about with the urinary system is that electrolytes, like sodium, and electrolyte and water balance are interdependent. And we learned in that urinary system that water and electrolytes are interdependent. They're dependent upon each other, kind of go hand in hand, because electrolytes are dissolved in water. Okay, so the electrolytes that we have in our body, a lot of them are dissolved in water. And so when we talk about electrolyte balance, we're typically talking about water balance as well, and vice versa. Okay, so when we talk about water balance, we're talking a lot of times about fluids in the body. Okay, water comes in many different forms and comes in many different types of fluids throughout the body. Okay, so when we're talking about body fluid balance, we're really talking about water balance in the body. Okay, now body fluids aren't distributed, the water in the body isn't just distributed equally throughout the body. Water is distributed in different, what we call compartments. And within those compartments, we'll talk about what those are here in a second, there are different volumes when you compare the different places water is found, and also different compositions, different concentrations of different types of electrolytes and things, and we'll see all of that coming up here. Water and electrolytes can also move between these compartments, and that water movement from one compartment to the next is going to be regulated to help with that maintaining the homeostasis of the fluid or water balance in the body. Okay, so again, here's kind of our typical situation where, you know, there's always exceptions to the rule, but on average, a kind of a quote unquote typical female is going to be about 50% water by weight. Okay, not volume, but by weight. And whereas males are a little bit more, they're closer to 60 to 63% water by weight. And the reason for this is, in general, not as a rule, but in general, women typically have more adipose tissue. And remember what adipose is? Adipose is fat tissue. So if you look at body composition of women versus men, in general, women tend to have a higher adipose content. And so remember, adipose, or fats, are hydrophobic. They don't like water. So those components of them, the adipose tissue replaces water with fat, okay? Whereas in males tend to have a higher density of muscle tissue, which is made up of proteins, and that's going to have more water in it. So that's why they're a little bit more dense in water. But in kind of a quote unquote average person, there's about 40 liters of water in a person, and that's a 20-some 2-liter bottles. And again, depending on different states of hydration, body composition, body size, age. All of those things are going to affect exactly how much water is in a body at any one time, but 40 is kind of a good rough number to use. Okay, so within that water that is in our bodies, okay, so you could easily say that the human body is made up of mostly water. Okay, a good half to 2/3 of the human body by weight is going to be water. And so within that water, we're going to have dissolved electrolytes, and we'll define those here in a little bit. And those electrolytes with their water that's dissolving them are going to be found in two major compartments. Remember I said that there's different compartments and water can go from one to the other or one to another. First is the intracellular compartment. So this is going to be water that's inside the cells, and about 2/3 or about 63% of the water in the body is found inside individual cells. Okay, so it's water inside cells or fluid inside of the cells. Okay, so if you had here's our 40 liters, about 25 of those 40 liters is going to be found inside individual cells all throughout the body. The other remaining fraction of our fluid is going to be extracellular fluid, and those are going to be places outside of the cell but inside of the body. Okay, so some examples of that are going to be, like we have seen, the interstitial fluid or the tissue fluid in between those tissue spaces, the liquid in the blood, okay, the blood plasma, water is going to be in there, and of course lymph, remember that fluid inside of the lymphatic vessels. And then there's what we call transcellular fluid, and these items here are going to be fluids that are not, not inside of cells, but they're going to be associated with different body structures, like spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, the humors in the eye, synovial fluid in the joints, okay? Those types of fluids. So again, most of our water is going to be found in cells, inside of cells. And then another large portion of that is going to be our interstitial fluid, blood plasma, next lymph, and then those other specialized fluid compartments like joint fluids and so forth. Okay, so we said that all of those fluids are going to have electrolytes dissolved in them, and depending on if the fluid is intracellular or extracellular will depend on the composition of that fluid, what is actually going to be dissolved into that fluid. So extracellular fluids, like in the blood plasma or interstitial fluid, would have high concentrations of sodium, chloride, calcium, and bicarbonate. And then blood plasma also will have more proteins, as we've seen before. And then we have intracellular fluids are going to be high in potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate. Okay, so just remember with that, I'm not going to ask you to remember, you know, all of the different electrolytes that are going to be dissolved in the extracellular fluid, but just remember that between extracellular and intracellular, that there's different compositions. Okay, now we also mentioned that water or fluid can move in between those compartments. And this slide here is going to kind of tie in a couple of other body systems that we've talked about, and to look at fluid movement in the body at kind of a little bit of a larger scale than we have before, and kind of tie in some body systems here. So we've already talked about within the cardiovascular system, fluid leaving the capillaries. Okay, here's a blood capillary. Blood is passing through here. Okay, in the respiratory system, we talked about gases leaving. and leaving the capillary and going to the cell. Okay, we're not going to worry about gases today. We're going to just talk about the fluid. But within the cardiovascular system, we talked about how hydrostatic pressure, that water pressure at the arterial end of the capillary, the end closest to the heart, okay, or closest to the left ventricle, is going to be under pressure, and that fluid pressure is going to push the fluid out of the capillary in between those capillary cells. Okay, so we've already talked about that. And then, so number one is going to be hydrostatic pressure, okay, pushing that fluid out, just like we saw with the cardiovascular system. Number two is going to be osmotic pressure. Colloid here means protein. Okay, osmotic pressure is going to draw fluid back into the capillary. Okay, so osmosis, because of proteins stuck in the blood, is going to pull fluid in. Hydrostatic pressure is going to push fluid out of the capillary, out of the blood plasma, and get it into that interstitial space. It turns it into interstitial fluid, which is just fluid kind of out here in just open areas. It's not part of a cell. Okay. Then we saw with the lymphatic system, this fluid, okay, here is going to also build up hydrostatic pressure. Okay, there's going to be fluid pressure here and fluid pressure here. And that hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid is going to push that fluid into the lymphatic vessel, and then it becomes lymph. And just to tie that in, lymph, remember, takes that fluid, filters it out through the lymph nodes, and goes all the way back to the subclavian vein and returns it to the circulatory system, okay, to get rid of that extra fluid. Okay, now interstitial fluid, number 4 down here, says that interstitial fluid is in equilibrium, or is equal to basically the pressures or osmosis or any other factors that are going to affect that fluid concentration or fluid movement. It's going to be in equilibrium with the intracellular fluid, the fluid inside of these cells, and then also the transcellular fluid. Say maybe this is a joint with some fluid in it there. Okay, so these are going to be fairly equal in their movement, and then we're going to get net movement out, net movement in, and net movement in there. Okay, so most of the fluid movement is going to be based on osmotic pressure pulling that fluid back into those capillaries. Okay, now water balance. Okay, water balance in the body, homeostasis in the body, exists when intake equals output. Okay, so we're going to look at water balance on a little broader scale than we did with the urinary system. Okay, so homeostasis requires that the body control intake and output. Okay, so we talked about how water output is controlled a little bit by the nephrons in the urinary system, but water intake also plays a factor. Okay, if a person is dehydrated, they're going to become thirsty. And there are thirst centers in the brain that detect if a person is dehydrated and basically cause the desire for that person to take a drink. Okay, so intake's controlled by the brain, output is controlled by the kidneys. Okay, so again, this is another, I just love this typical type of situation here. It's going to change person to person, day to day, you know, year to year kind of thing. But if you want to kind of put a round number on it, intake of water, or I should say water gain each day for an adult is about 2.5 liters, or 2,500 milliliters. Now, we don't just get all of our water from drinking, okay? We get most of our water from drinking, but that's about only 60% of the water that our body utilizes is from actual drinking of liquids. Okay, we get another 30% from moist foods that we eat. Say you have a soup or you eat vegetables. Watermelon has a ton of water in it. Okay, so we get some liquids from foods, and then another 10% is going to be a result of metabolism. Okay, metabolic chemical reactions that are occurring in your cells. Okay, so water intake comes from drinking, comes from food, and it comes from metabolism. Okay, so make sure you know the sources. Sorry, that says sources of water intake or water gain. Okay, over here we talk about output. I'm going to come back to this slide here in just a little bit. Okay, but I wanted to talk about how water intake is regulated. Okay, so if the body loses as little as 1% of its water, okay, so say you're out working and it's 100 degrees out and you're sweating, okay, you're going to get thirsty because you've lost 1% or more of your body's water. Okay, that is going to change the osmotic pressure. It's going to change the composition of your extracellular fluid, and it's going to stimulate receptors in the hypothalamus in the brain. Okay, so let me just explain this here just for a second. Okay, so say you have, here's a milliliter of water. I know it's square, but just play with me here. And it has, 10 milligrams of electrolytes in it. Okay, if you remove some of that water, okay, you remove 10% of that water, you're still going to have, say you have a 10% solution here. If you remove some of the water, now you're going to say, now you might have a 12% solution of electrolytes in your body's extracellular fluid. Okay, so your fluid became more concentrated, and that osmotic force is going to change as well. So the hypothalamus in the brain is going to detect this change over here, and the hypothalamus then is going to cause the person to become thirsty, and hopefully the person will decide to go and take a drink. Okay, then the person drinks, and distension, or the expansion of the stomach, remember the ruggy allows the stomach to increase its size when it's filled. That distension in the act of drinking basically tells the thirst centers in the brain that say, okay, we've gotten a drink, we have enough water now, it's all good. Okay, so water's then going to be absorbed a little bit by the stomach, little by the small intestine, and then a few hours later water is going to be reabsorbed in the large intestine as well, and then that osmotic pressure, this concentration here, is going to go back to normal. Okay, now if the person didn't drink enough, they're still going to be thirsty, and it's going to continue until they have an adequate water balance. Okay, so the primary regulator of water intake is going to be thirst. Okay, now water output. Okay, when we have water balance, we want to typically have output equal input. Okay, so we had 2,500 milliliters or 2.5 liters input. That's probably about what's going to be output. Okay, water loss. Okay, here's some sources of water loss. Okay, urine, feces, sweat, and then evaporation from the skin, and also from the lungs. Okay, have you ever breathed on a cold window or if your breath is warm and there's a cold piece of metal or window and you breathe on it and you can see your breath, it's because of the moisture. So you not only breathe out gases, but also water as well when you exhale. So about a third, 25 to 30%, whoops, come back, of the water is through leaving from the lungs, and then just water evaporating from the skin. And that's going to be different than sweating. Okay. And again, as you probably already know, water output's going to vary with temperature, activity, you know, how much you're sweating, how much activity you're doing, all of those types of things. Okay. And so we know that water output is adjusted if you're not getting enough intake, or if you're getting too much water, the output will increase. Okay. So I'm going to just back up to this slide. Again, make sure you know these sources of intake and sources of or ways that water is output or lost from the body. So urine, skin and lungs, feces, and sweat are the major ways that we lose water. Okay, so how is this regulated? Okay, say we have a situation where the person is dehydrated. Okay, we'll look at excess water intake here in a second. But say the person is dehydrated, and just like we saw in that last slide, their fluid is going to become more osmotically concentrated. You're going to have more things, more electrolytes dissolved in it. The hypothalamus is going to detect that. And so the hypothalamus is also going to tell part of the brain, the posterior pituitary, to release ADH. ADH, remember, is a hormone called let me write it up here. Antidiuretic hormone. Remember, a diuretic increases the volume of urine, okay, makes you go more. So if you're dehydrated, the brain, the hypothalamus, is going to detect that, tell another gland, part of the endocrine system, the posterior pituitary, to release this hormone that goes through the blood to the kidneys, and it tells, okay, so remember your kidney anatomy, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts, the far tubules away from the nephron, to increase water reabsorption. Now, if you remember back to the urinary system, when there's plenty of water, the distal tubule and the collecting ducts are very impermeable. They're closed off to get water back out and into the blood. They don't really reabsorb a lot of water unless ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, is present. So it's important, if a person is dehydrated, if they don't have enough water, that they would get more of that water recycled or reabsorbed back into the blood from the urine. Okay, so in the presence of ADH, during dehydration, urine output is going to decrease to prevent water loss, okay, to try to conserve that water. On the other hand, if a person, say they drank 3 water bottles and weren't really sweating a whole lot, and they have a little bit too much water that they've intaken. Okay, so that extracellular fluid is going to become less concentrated. The hypothalamus is going to detect that. It's going to tell the posterior pituitary to decrease or maybe even to stop ADH production. Okay, that signal is going to slow down or stop going to the kidneys. And so those tubules, the distal tubule, the collecting ducts, they're going to start to decrease water reabsorption. They're going to become more impermeable to water. They're going to trap that water in the tubule, and it's going to be excreted in the urine. Okay, so that's a way to get rid of that excess urine, or I'm sorry, excess water. Okay, so there's a mechanism, the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. is going to tell the posterior pituitary to release ADH. And those are going to basically tell the kidney whether to concentrate the urine and reabsorb the water, or dilute the urine and get rid of excess. Okay, so we've kind of talked about this down here as well. Okay, on this page, I'd like for you to check this out. I believe it's on page 810 and 811. It's close there. It's clinical application 21.1. But that gives us right here the definition of dehydration. Okay, that stands for definition, which is basically water deficiency where output exceeds intake. Okay, you've gotten rid of too much water either through sweating or urination or whatever. Your intake isn't as it should be. Okay, now we all know that dehydration causes problems in the body. Okay, causes some issues with nervous system, causes headaches, causes all kinds of things. If you get severely dehydrated, it can make your body temperature get too hot, okay, because there's not enough water there for sweating and other body functions. Okay, so you can read a little bit more about that as well. And then water intoxication. It used to be kind of popular for radio, like morning radio programs, to do competitions where if you could drink a gallon of water in like an hour or whatever X amount of time, you would win a prize. Well, people started dying from that because if you drink too much water, it can actually be toxic and cause the body to some organ systems to start to fail. So water intoxication is basically so much excess water that you basically wash out the sodium in the body. You dilute out the body's water or the body's fluid. Excuse me. When I talk a lot, I yawn. You basically dilute out the body's fluid concentrations, and you can get what's called hyponatremia, which is low levels of blood sodium. Okay, and so that's very detrimental to the body, and it creates an imbalance of water and electrolytes. Okay, so drinking too much water is not good either. You got to have a balance. Okay, and then the other one is edema. You can review that on your own, but we've talked about edema before. Okay, the next unit talks about the electrolyte balance. Okay, so electrolytes are kind of like salts, if you will. And so yes, table salt is an electrolyte, but there are other types of salts as well. And these are substances, electrolytes are substances that release ions in water. Okay, so if you think of sodium chloride, NaCl, table salt, you put it in water, it dissolves, right? And it's going to release sodium and chloride. These molecules right there are ions because they have a charge. This one has a positive charge, this one has a negative charge. Okay, so that's what an electrolyte is. We get electrolytes, excuse me, oh goodness, sorry, from the foods we eat, from the things that we drink, and then also from metabolism. Okay, electrolyte output, sweating, right? Sweat is salty, feces, and urine. Okay, so here's some examples of some electrolytes: sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chloride, sulfate, phosphate, bicarbonate, and hydrogen ions. Let's see. Usually we have, in humans with a good diet, I shouldn't say necessarily good diet, but adequate access to food, we have sufficient numbers of electrolytes in our diet. Okay, now if there was an extreme deficiency in electrolytes, you would have a salt craving. Sometimes animals like deer and livestock can have salt cravings because they aren't getting those electrolytes through their roughage diet, through the plant material that they're eating, and they may seek out sources of salt. But typically in humans, we get sufficient amounts of salt through our diet and things that we drink. Okay, so we don't usually have to worry about electrolyte input, but electrolyte output is a little bit more of a concern. Some electrolytes, as we saw, are through perspiration. That's why they invented Gatorade for the athletes that are working and perspiring. And they wanted them not only to replace the fluids, but also the electrolytes that are lost during sweating and exercise and all those kinds of things. We talked about electrolytes lost in the feces and also lost in the urine. And the urine, okay, that's going to be where you have the greatest control of electrolyte loss. Okay, so that excretion of those electrolytes is going to be regulated in the kidneys to help maintain homeostasis. The next two slides are kind of busy, I think. But what I wanted to just point out with these two slides, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on them, is that the electrolytes, if you remember back to A&P1, with nerve impulses, with muscular contractions, all of those things, those signals are sent by ions like sodium and potassium and calcium. Okay, so potassium is very important for nerve and heart muscle impulses. Okay, sodium here is a really big component of the electrolytes in the body. Okay, and the things that I want you to remember here is that aldosterone, again, that's a hormone, is going to regulate sodium and potassium concentrations in the kidney, through the kidney. Okay, so it can either reabsorb or secrete those ions. And then also parathyroid hormone, another hormone here, is going to regulate calcium, the calcium ion. Okay, so that's just all I really wanted you to remember there is the function of ions in the body, and then those two hormones are going to help with regulating electrolyte compositions. Okay, and this kind of just goes through the same type of process. If there's not as much calcium in the blood plasma as there should be, the parathyroid gland, which we'll talk about in chapter 13, sends parathyroid hormone to the bloodstream and gets more by talking to the bones and talking to the kidneys. It's going to say, okay, we're too low on calcium, do some more reabsorption, get some of that out of the urine, get some of that calcium back into the blood. Okay, same thing with potassium. Aldosterone is going to help conserve that in the kidneys as well. Okay, sodium and potassium balances. So remember, these are two important electrolytes. Okay, so if a person, their sodium is too low, maybe from vomiting for days because of an illness, or you're that person that took the challenge on whatever the radio show or whatever it was, and you drink too much water. Hyponatremia is low blood calcium. Hyponatremia is, did I say high? Hyponatremia is low blood sodium. Hyper means too much. Hypernatremia is high blood sodium. And you can see that when you have excess water loss, like with a fever, if you sweat too much, or you have diabetes. It can cause coma, cause all kinds of problems. Way I remember this is Na, natremia, and then kalemia has that K in it. Hypokalemia is low blood potassium. Hyperkalemia is high blood potassium. And high blood potassium and low blood potassium, if that's not maintained in balance, can cause heart problems. Okay, now acids and bases. We have talked some about acids and bases, not only with the blood chapter, but with the cardiovascular system, with the respiratory system, all kinds of different body systems. Okay, acids and bases must be kept, your body's pH must be kept in balance, or there's a lot of problems that can happen. So I'm not going to have you remember the quote unquote chemical definition of acids and bases, but just remember that an acid is anything with a pH of 0 to 7, and a base is going to be anything from 7 to 14. Okay, so your alkaline substances are going to be your bases. But pH, okay, and determining whether something is acidic, basic, or neutral is going to determine or depend on hydrogen ions. Okay, so remember that the more hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic a solution is. Okay, so keeping the concentration of hydrogen ions at an acceptable level in the body is going to be very, very important. Okay, so the more acidic the solution, the lower its pH, and also the higher the hydrogen ion concentration, and the more basic or alkaline would be the lower hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, normal pH in the blood should be about 7.4. You get too far out of this and you get acidosis or alkalosis, which causes some serious problems in the body. Okay, so this is something I definitely want you to know, is what is a safe or normal blood pH, and that's, you can give the range 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, so where do we get hydrogen ions? Where do they come from? Short answer, metabolism. Metabolism of glucose, fatty acids, lipids, amino acids or proteins, and nucleic acids. Okay, all of those things breaking down release hydrogen ions into the body, into the interstitial fluid, into the blood plasma, wherever. Okay, so most hydrogen ions are a byproduct of metabolism. Okay, so there's a slide here that talks about strong acids and bases and weak acids and bases. I'm not going to have you remember the differences in those, but some acids are stronger. They affect systems more than others. Okay. So we talked about in the respiratory system how hydrogen ions are detected by the brain, and the respiratory system can be altered to either get rid of or conserve those hydrogen ions. Okay, so either a shift in acid levels or base levels could threaten or cause issues with the body's internal environment. Okay, so there's some ways that the body can maintain its pH or eliminate excess acids. Okay, and we're going to talk about these three methods. The first one is the acid-base buffer system, respiratory system, and then the renal or the urinary system, clearing those extra hydrogen ions. So again, make sure you know those here. Okay, so the first one is the chemical buffer system, and we're going to talk about a couple of these, but we'll focus mainly on the bicarbonate buffer system. A buffer is a substance that stabilizes pH, or sometimes it's said that they resist pH change. Okay, when an acid or a base is added to that solution, it helps resist the change. It helps the body not have drastic shifts in pH. Okay, So we see buffers in blood plasma. We see them in a lot of different fluids throughout the body. Okay, so buffers combine with strong acids and convert them to weaker acids, or strong bases to weaker bases. Okay, so I want you to definitely know about the bicarbonate buffer system. We've talked about it quite a bit already, so some of this should be review, okay? But make sure you know about the bicarbonate buffer system, okay? These buffers, bicarbonate, is found both in the intracellular and extracellular fluids. So it's found inside of the cells and also in fluids outside of the cells, okay? So we start out here with bicarbonate. Okay, this is bicarbonate. And bicarbonate, if you have, in this situation here, if you have acidic conditions, remember acidic conditions have a lot of hydrogen ions. Okay, if you have too many hydrogen ions floating around, say in the blood plasma, bicarbonate here is going to form a bond with that hydrogen ion and pull it out of solution. Okay, it's going to pull it out of the blood, and it attaches, it's going to run this reaction this way and attach it. Do you see HCO3 minus? HCO3, okay, here's 2, we added this one. Okay, it's going to pull that hydrogen out of the blood, out of the plasma, out of the interstitial fluid, the lymphatic fluid, wherever, and attach it into this molecule, which is now called carbonic acid. Okay, so this hydrogen here was a very strong acid. Carbonic acid is more of a weak acid. Okay, if now our buffers are working, our hydrogen ion levels get back to normal, we're doing good, and then all of a sudden hydrogen ion levels drop. We can run the reaction to the left, or we can run it this way, and carbonic acid can go through the reaction, can kind of reverse that reaction and produce a hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. And that would release that hydrogen ion into the blood or whatever fluid and raise the hydrogen ion levels, which will then cause it to become more acidic. Okay, so bicarbonate, HCO3, can either grab onto hydrogen ions or it can release hydrogen ions to help keep the pH at an appropriate level. Okay, that's how that buffer system works. The phosphate buffer system is very, very similar. Okay, this is monohydrogen phosphate right here. It can do the same thing. It can grab onto a hydrogen ion if it's too acidic. Pull that hydrogen ion out of solution, bind it together, and now it's converted to dihydrogen phosphate. Okay, dihydrogen phosphate there. Same thing, it can reverse if the pH is too high and it needs to become more acidic. Can release that hydrogen ion and release that back into the fluid. Okay, and then I'm not going to really talk about the protein buffer system, but plasma proteins in the plasma can also do the same kind of thing, is grab on or release those hydrogen ions. Okay, so that's the chemical buffer system that can help maintain pH balance, maintain acid-base balance in the body. Okay, there's a summary of those different chemical buffer systems. Now we saw in the respiratory system that the respiratory system can help with acid-base balance as well. Okay, we learned in the respiratory system that the respiratory centers in the brain stem, can help regulate those hydrogen ions by controlling both the rate, how fast you're breathing, and how deep you're breathing, the rate and depth of breathing. Okay, so in the respiratory system, what's going to be driving all of this is carbon dioxide. Okay, not necessarily hydrogen ions initially, but carbon dioxide. Okay, so we saw in the respiratory system that if you have excess of carbon dioxide, if the concentrations of carbon dioxide are too high, what will happen in the respiratory center of the brain is that carbon dioxide will form a bond with water and form, remember this guy, carbonic acid. Okay, carbonic acid will then release the hydrogen ion and it will go into the solution. It will increase acidity of that solution. The respiratory center in the brain is going to detect that, and it's going to increase the rate and depth of breathing so you can excrete more carbon dioxide from the lungs. Okay, so essentially what's happening here is you are driving this reaction in this way so that the carbon dioxide gets exhaled through the body. Okay. The third mechanism is going to be the renal system, or excreting hydrogen ions through the kidneys. And the nephrons can remove those extra hydrogen ions in the urine. Okay, so hydrogen ions are added to the urine through secretion, not necessarily through glomerular filtration, but secretion. And basically when there's excess hydrogen ions, they are put into the tubular fluid, into the urine, through that secretion process. Talks here about phosphoric and sulfuric acid, high protein diets. They can produce excess acids, and in that way the kidneys can help compensate for the extra acids, increase tubular secretion, and more hydrogen ions are secreted or excreted in the urine. Okay, so you have a high protein level in the diet. That can be broken down into amino acids, which can be broken down into those sulfuric, phosphoric acids. And those hydrogen ions can then be excreted in the urine by the tubular secretion in the nephrons. Okay, so how quickly do these mechanisms work? How fast can we get our pH regulated? Okay, acid-base regulation happens very, very quickly. Almost immediately. Okay, so the first line of this is going to be the chemical buffer system. Then the secondary or second line of defense will be like the respiratory and the kidneys. Okay, the respiratory system and the kidneys. So the respiratory system takes a few minutes to kick in. The urinary system might take a little bit longer. Okay, and this would be more for something like with a change in the diet. Okay, so chemical buffers act quickly, respiratory system acts fairly quickly, urinary system takes a couple of days to catch up, but it does help. Okay, so again, normal pH range in our fluids, especially the blood fluid, is going to be between that 7.35 to 7.45. Make sure you know that. You get any lower than that, you're going to have acidosis. Any higher, you're going to have alkalosis. Okay, so if your blood pH came over here and got to be about, say, 7.7, you're in danger. Or if you come over here and you're at, say, 7.1, that's not a good thing. So keeping the blood pH in balance is very important. Okay, so how does the body get into acidosis or alkalosis? Okay, we saw how we can get back to normal through those buffer systems and renal and respiratory system, but what about the way you get there in the first place? Okay, well, with acidosis becoming the fluid's blood pH becoming too acidic, okay, which is too low in pH, you can get that from a loss of bases, okay, losing bases in the body. And we'll talk about those here in just a second, how you can do that, or accumulating acids. Okay, so we'll talk about that more specifically here in a second. Those are going to increase the concentration of hydrogen ions and cause that pH to shift. So anything lower than 735 is acidosis. Anything over 745 is alkalosis. And where you have kind of the opposite here, you lose acids or you get too many bases, decreases the concentration of hydrogen ions, and then shifts the pH to a higher level. Okay, so there's two types of acidosis. There's respiratory acidosis, which is affected by carbon dioxide. Okay, so anytime you hear respiratory acidosis, think issues with carbon dioxide. Okay, because remember we saw in this chapter and before how carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentrations are tied together. Then we have also metabolic acidosis, when that's from the acid accumulation or the loss of bases. So with respiratory acidosis, okay, you can get a buildup of CO2, which causes that acidosis. If there's a problem with the respiratory system, okay, you have a decreased rate and depth of breathing, okay, or an obstruction. Say a patient is choking on something and they can't get air down into their lungs, or maybe they have pneumonia and they cannot exchange gases. Okay, maybe they have COPD. Okay, those things are going to cause an accumulation of carbon dioxide, which is then going to cause respiratory acidosis. Metabolic acidosis comes from two ways, okay? Accumulation of acids or loss of bases. So how can you accumulate acids? Okay, well, maybe the patient has kidney failure and they're not excreting those hydrogen ions through the kidneys. Maybe a person with diabetes is breaking down ketones, okay, breaking down proteins in the body for energy because they cannot properly use glucose, okay? Those would be some ways to basically get excess acids in the body. Another way to get metabolic acidosis is prolonged diarrhea, okay, because there's a lot of alkaline secretions in the small intestine to neutralize the acids that are coming through in the chyme from the stomach. And so if there's a lot of diarrhea for days and days and days, you're going to lose a lot of those bases that help maintain the pH balance. Also, prolonged vomiting with intestinal secretions. Sometimes you can vomit a lot and the intestinal secretions start coming out the mouth as well, coming out in the vomit. So you can lose bases in that way as well. So remember, acidosis comes in two forms: problems with the respiratory system, and then over here, metabolic acidosis is basically kind of all the other causes of excess base removal or accumulating too many acids. Okay, so looking at it in the other way, alkalosis, you have respiratory alkalosis as well. So respiratory alkalosis pretty much comes from hyperventilation, okay, breathing too fast, okay. You know, maybe the person's hyperventilating, they're breathing way too fast, maybe because they're nervous about something, or because they're poisoned with something, or they're at a high altitude that they haven't adjusted to, and they're breathing too much. You lose too many molecules of carbon dioxide, which basically trickles down, prevents an accumulation of hydrogen ions, and the person's blood, the person's overall pH status becomes alkaline. Okay, then the metabolic acidosis alkalosis is basically the reverse of the metabolic acidosis, where you have a loss of acids. Okay, sometimes diuretic medications can cause you to secrete too many acids or too many hydrogen ions. You can get vomiting of all your gastric secretions. There's a lot of acids, as you know, in the stomach. And then a loss of bases. A lot of times you would see that if a person took too many antacids, because those are bases as well. Okay, so any shift in pH needs to be closely shifted back to maintain that good pH range of 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, one last section here in this chapter is what we call compensation. And I think this is really cool how the body systems work together to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so compensation is basically a process that resists pH change, pH shift during acid-base imbalance. Okay, so this process is accomplished by changes in the action of chemical buffers, the respiratory system, and the renal system. Okay, so an example of this is, okay, say a person is in metabolic acidosis because they consume too many antacids. They misread the label and they consume 3 times as many Tums as they were supposed to. Okay, the chemical buffers are going to start working. Okay, the phosphate buffer system, the bicarbonate buffer system, those are going to start working. Okay, the rate and depth of breathing is going to decrease. Okay, because we're wanting to conserve or retain those carbon dioxides to help lower the pH, to help them get more hydrogen ions. Okay, then also the kidneys are going to decrease tubular secretion of hydrogen ions and retain those hydrogen ions and prevent those hydrogen ions from entering the urine. Okay, so the buffer systems, the kidneys, and the respiratory system are going to all work together to try to get that pH back into that healthy normal range. Okay, here's another example. A patient has respiratory acidosis because they have pulmonary or lung disease. Okay, so the body becomes too acidic, the fluids become too acidic, the buffers again are going to work, the kidneys are going to work to secrete hydrogen ions and get those out in the urine, but the respiratory system, it can't do anything. It can help maybe just a little bit, but it's not pulling its weight. So the buffer system and the kidneys are going to have to pick up more of the slack. They're going to compensate for the respiratory system to help maintain that pH balance. Okay, so this is an example of how the 3 different body systems work together. Well, the 2 body systems and the buffer system works together to maintain body pH. Okay, so that finishes up chapter 21. There is a Connect homework for chapter 21 that will be due on Thursday. So make sure you check out the daily checklist on that. Make sure you do your mastering homework, or sorry, Connect homework. And then there is no Learn Smart activity. All you have to do is the Connect homework for chapter 21. On Wednesday, we're going to start into chapter 13. Okay, so we're going to go back to the endocrine system and we're going to spend 2 days on chapter 13. So begin reading that and be moving forward with that. If you haven't seen already, your grade for exam 3, those should be posted very quickly within the next day or so, if those aren't posted already by the time you see this. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. If there's something else that you would like me to re-explain, just let me know, and we'll talk to you again soon.